Thank you for those of you who are here to participate in the Grief Talk Challenge webinar. And what I wanted to do today is basically give you the Netflix version where we are going to binge watch all 7 days of the Grief Talk Challenge in less than an hour. And if those of you who stick around, I would love to have a conversation with you at the end of the webinar if you're able to talk, or even just chatting with typing over Messenger. If you have any questions or want further information. So in the Grief Talk Challenge, we talked about how do you master the 7 keys and what are the 7 keys to a successful grief conversation with your child. And I see that, but it's not letting me click through. Oh, there we go. It wasn't letting me click through my slides. So welcome to all of you. And my name is Dr. Annette Athy. For those of you who don't know me, I am a grief specialist and child development expert. I have been working in the field for over 20 years. And the information that I am bringing today is based on a variety of places that I have worked. I've worked with families in grief and crisis and trauma in many settings, community mental health, private practice, a grief agency. So many different things have kind of brought me here today. And so what I have done is taken all of my expertise and put it in a package to make these grief conversations easier for parents. It's kind of the how-to. And so during that 7 days, we talked about the 7 keys for having a successful conversation. And day 1, we talked about roadblocks. Day 2, we talked about how to set the stage. Day 3, preparing yourself as the parent to walk in to have the conversation. Day 4, to talk or not to talk. So how do you have the conversations if your child's not willing to engage in verbal communication? Day 5, we talked about conversation starters. So how do you even begin the sentence, or what do you say? And then day 6, looking at those expectations and goals that sometimes trip us up and get in the way of our progress. And then day 7, we took all of these keys and put them together into your personalized blueprint that's individual for your family, your household. So we're going to go over all of that today. So it's going to be a lot, but don't worry. Like I mentioned, we are recording and I will be emailing out the recording, so you will have access to that. So the 4 roadblocks are, we want to look at, is it the parent or is it the child? So whose roadblocks are they? Is it family dynamics that are getting in the way? Is it traditions or behaviors? So maybe in your household, you don't talk about grief, or the topic of how somebody died isn't shared or communicated. Again, we want to look at those roadblocks to figure out what's getting in our way, what's preventing us or stopping us from having these conversations that may stem all the way back to our own childhood or even generations, like this is what our family has always done. Avoiding. So some of us, and again, for good reason, we might be avoiding the situation. We just don't want to talk about it. We don't want to bring up negative feelings. We don't want to address grief head on. And sometimes that's a protection factor for us, that we are protecting ourselves by not talking about it. Or our child is protecting us. They don't want to see mom or dad cry. They don't want to see grandma cry when we mention about our loved one who's passed away. And also, there can be some overwhelm. Our nervous system is just taking on too much and it can't deal with one more thing. So complex feelings. sometimes we can't separate the reasons of why we feel this way or what we're feeling. It's kind of that tornado feeling where it's this mixture of I'm mad, but I'm sad, but I want to be happy, but I'm not happy. And we just can't tell the difference. Another reason that it might be complex is maybe we're unfamiliar to grief. Maybe we have good, strong genes in our family, and longevity is a huge part of our family, and we've not had loved ones pass away. And so maybe this grief or what a funeral looks like or things like that is not something we've encountered, and now we have to help our child through it, but we've never experienced it ourselves as a parent. And again, for our child, this could be a completely uncharted territory where this is the first person who has passed away. Behaviors sometimes add some complexity there, where we can't tell the difference. Are they mad, or is it really sadness? Or are they mad about how this person died, or that they didn't know, or they didn't get to be there in the end? And then sometimes those end of life decisions put an extra burden on us that lead to complex feelings where a family member was adamant that this is not how this person wanted to die, but somebody else in the family said, yes, this is what they always said they wanted. And so those end of life decisions can add a lot more stress and negative feelings surrounding the death. And then maybe it's just resistance, that we don't want to grieve, or we don't want to stop grieving because we believe that if we stop grieving, it means we don't care or we don't miss the person who has died. Or possibly there's a reason or a purpose we are trying to keep this grief with us, that somehow this is our burden to carry for the rest of our life because that's how much we loved this person. And so sometimes it's coming together and talking about what are our beliefs about grief and about death. And sometimes we don't even know what those things are until we're right in the middle. And then we realize, oh, there were some deeper layers there that I was unaware of. On day 2, we talked about how to set the stage. So we talked about the location. How do you set up privacy to have these conversations with your kids? Do you have it in a comfortable place? Do you have it at the kitchen table? Do you go outside and have it in nature? Do you dim the lights and kind of set the mood or the tone in the room? Do you have a place where you and your child can sit together instead of sitting in opposite chairs or across the room from each other? For some teenagers, having these conversations in a vehicle is better because the pressure is not on them to make eye contact with you and feeling pressure to answer you. Some kids like to have these conversations in the dark, again, with the same idea as being in the vehicle. They don't have to make eye contact with you because they do want to please you. And sometimes they're unsure what to say or how to say it. And so instead of getting it wrong, they just won't say it at all. Sometimes time is an issue, and there might be time restrictions. So for instance, with your younger kiddos, you wouldn't want to have these conversations right before nap time. With any of your kids, you wouldn't necessarily want to have these conversations right before bed because that doesn't allow for time for your child to think about and process what you just talked about, and then allowing them to come back to you if they have questions. Because if you had this talk at bedtime and then sent them to bed and they laid there alone in their room and started to think about all the things you said, my guess is if they got out of bed 5 more times to ask you questions, just like when they get out of bed to use the bathroom 1 more time or get a drink, your frustration level is going to go up. And so we want to set these conversations up for success. This is all of the things we can do before the conversation even starts that's going to encourage it to be successful and productive. Not having these conversations right before a big event. So for instance, I had a client who they decided to deliver bad news to him right before the big homecoming game. What an awful time to find out about the loss of a loved one when it could have waited until afterward. Again, sometimes circumstances dictate that we don't wait, but sometimes we do have the option. And having these conversations, these follow-up conversations later on after our loved one has died, having them in a time that is going to make it successful is key. Possibly looking at, are you having it before or after a meal? So I don't know about you, but I have one child who gets incredibly hangry, and having a serious conversation with her before she has eaten is not going to go well. She's not going to focus. She's going to be irritated with me, and she's going to think that I'm wasting her time. But if I've already fed her, that's one less thing to get in the way, one less negative impact on our conversation. And again, like I mentioned, having that time to process. Sometimes our kids just need time. Distractions. Our teenagers usually have their phone at their fingertips, and as adults, we often have our phones right there too. So that may be something that you make a pact that both of you leave your phones outside in the hallway if you're talking in their bedroom, or you leave them in the bedroom if you're going to talk in the kitchen, or put them on silent. Having electronics like the TV or a tablet where they're half listening to you and half listening to their video or playing a game while they talk are just distractions that can get in the way. Again, leading us as parents to get frustrated. Why aren't you listening? Why aren't you paying attention? Siblings can be either a comfort item or a distraction. And some of that may depend on the age of your kids. Sometimes having siblings there during these grief conversations is a good thing. But if you have a teenager and a toddler, that toddler isn't going to have the same attention span as your teenager and is going to easily tire from the conversation and not be helpful to have a successful conversation with your teenager. Sometimes pets can be the same. Again, pets can be a comfort, but they can also be a distraction if they're running around playing and your child's focused on what the dog is doing. I had mentioned location of going outside. And again, I think this is where knowing your child is best. But sometimes having these conversations outside is great to be in nature, but it can also be a distraction with the birds and the neighbors and cars. And so again, you are the expert of your children. You know where a conversation is going to be best. And this is experiment time. Try it out. Maybe you think outside would be a perfect place. And then you go out there and you're like, wow, there was more distractions than I anticipated on our front deck. We need to redo this. So then next time you'll know that you don't want to have it on the front porch. Again, trial and error is important. We're not necessarily going to get it perfect the first time. And so also having comfort items. And I think this is something we forget because we think my child will be focused better if they're sitting there with no toys, nothing to play with, and then they will listen and be ready to talk. But our kids, when it comes to grief, need that comfort thing. So whether that's a stuffed animal, whether that's a blanket, whether that's a pet or a sibling, anything that's comfort is going to be helpful. In my office, I have a basket of fidgets that sit on my table all the time. And I have a variety of textures that are in there. And so the kids that I talk with know that you can grab one if you want, but you don't have to. And so just knowing they have the option or that it's there and available sometimes is all they need. And then they will let you know, yeah, this was helpful, or no, this really wasn't. So on day 3, we talked about 4 ways to prepare yourself. And so these things that I am going to talk about right here are things that you as the parent can do, but also you can do on your own, or you can teach your child. So these are a work smarter, not harder type thing. All of them are things you can do immediately. You don't have to have special training. You don't have to have special equipment. But the more that you can help your nervous system get to a calm, anchored spot, the easier it's going to be to have those conversations with your child. The easier it's going to be to let your child talk about these emotional things because they're going to borrow some of your peace. If you come to the table peaceful and prepared, not bringing your stress and anxiety, they're going to be more apt to talk with you and more willing to share because they're not going to be worried that mom's not going to get it, dad's not going to understand, because they feel the difference. So the first way that I talked about was deep breathing, and we're going to do belly breathing. So that's, you take a big deep breath all the way from your belly and you bring it up with a big noisy outlet. And the reason why that noisy outlet is that pushes that negative energy, that stress energy, that anxiety energy out of your body. But for those of you who are kind of doubting that noisy part, try it yourself. Try just a regular big breath and let it out. And then try a deep breath using that noisier breath. And I think you will feel the difference. You'll feel the benefit. And the more you practice that, the easier it will be. The other breathing technique I like is the high 5 breathing, where you have your 5 fingers, you go up, breathing in, holding in, and then breathing out. And you do that all 5. If 5's not enough, then you do it a second time. But the nice part about the high 5 breathing is you have that tactile, you have that touch. And for some people, they need that tactile stimulation, but also this helps you keep count because it's real easy for us to get distracted, do 1 or 2 breaths and think that's enough. But 5 really is a better number because it really will make a difference with your nervous system. So the second thing is visualization. And this is almost just what it sounds like. We're going to imagine our favorite place or our happy place. And it can be a real or an imagined place. It can be a scene from a movie. It can be a place that you went on vacation or a place that you want to go. but I would highly encourage you, whatever that visual is, that you take a screenshot of it and put it as your screensaver on your computer or on your phone, or just have it in your photos so that you have easy access to that image. Because again, it increases those happy hormones, which helps us relax and calm our nervous system. Another simple way that not only relaxes our nervous system, but for those around you, oftentimes, if you yawn or sigh, guess what? The person next to you is going to be yawning or sighing here in just a minute. And so sometimes by getting our nervous system in a calm ventral place, but our teenager isn't, by us taking a big sigh or a big yawn, it can trigger those around us to do the same. And that helps them bring their nervous system down into a more calm place. And nobody has to teach you how to do that. You know, toddlers can do that, adults can do that, teenagers can do that. And so that's a real simple one. And each time you do it, you're resetting your nervous system. Meditation and tapping. So meditation, we're clearing the mind. For myself, I'm not a huge fan of meditation. It just doesn't work well for me, because the more I tell myself not to think about anything or to clear my mind, the more my stress and to-do lists start to overpower me. And so meditation may be something that you enjoy and that you like. And if so, fantastic, keep doing it. And it would be great to do just a 2 to 5 minute meditation before you walked in to have this conversation with your child. But for me, what I found more effective is tapping. And tapping is tapping on your acupressure points. And for those of you who might be new here today watching this, I do have in our Facebook group EFT tapping from 2 weeks ago. And you can go and look up that video where I do talk you through all of the details of tapping, what it's helpful for, and how to use it. And I actually run through a grief tapping script in that live. So for those of you who want to know more about tapping, that is a great place to go look. So 4 ways to talk or to not talk. So again, I know many parents have kids in a wide range of ages, and sometimes they're not talking because they're not able to put the words together, or they're not choosing to talk. And so these things that I am talking about today are ones that you can use with any age child. So sometimes hand gestures or note cards. So maybe you have a hand signal, you know, how was your day? Was it a thumbs up? Was it okay? Was it thumbs down? Maybe you have a secret code. Maybe you and your child create 2 or 3 hand gestures that mean different things. Because sometimes when we're activated in our nervous system, we can't come up with the words. It's difficult. And then we add in emotional topics like grief, where it brings up sadness, or it might bring up anger, hurt, resentment, all of those feelings that most of us want to avoid. Having some nonverbal ways to communicate helps us parents have a better idea what's going on, but it also gives our child a way to communicate with us. And so we can also use note cards with a similar idea as the hand signals, where maybe on the note cards it says yes or no. In the Grief Talk Challenge, one of the parents asked about emojis. You could absolutely do emojis on a note card, or for those of you who have teenagers, maybe you use emojis where you just text back and forth a couple of times. How was your day? And they know that they can send it in an emoji form. These are just other ways to start the conversation. These are the pre-steps for those bigger talks. So drawing, this one is something you could have your child draw out how they're feeling, or draw out the answers to the questions that you're talking about if they don't feel like talking. It may also be something that you sit down and maybe you have one of those adult coloring books and you're both coloring. And while you're coloring, then you're just talking about the person who died, or you're talking about things that are coming up. For instance, the holidays. Maybe you're talking about what tradition they remember celebrating with mom or celebrating with grandma, and how do they want to celebrate it this year. So those are great ways to connect and build on that relationship with your child. And then there's journal writing. And for a lot of people, journal writing can have kind of a negative idea in your head as to, oh, great, now I have to write paragraphs. Now I have to write a book. Now I have to spell everything right. And that can be so stressful. So when I am talking about journaling, I am not talking about journaling in the traditional sense. I am encouraging you to use it more as a drawing notebook, or taking a quote from Pinterest and writing about that. But put a time frame on it. Maybe encourage your child, or for yourself, I'm only going to write about this for 2 to 5 minutes. Take the pressure off that you have to write pages and pages for it to feel like you've done enough. Maybe you use your journal as a brain dump, where you just write all the things that you are thinking about, the good, the bad, the ugly, and just get it all out of your head. Because what we know about the nervous system is that if we can take those things out of our head, instead of them spinning and growing up here, we take them out, we set them down. Sometimes when we walk away, they don't seem as bad as they did when they were in our head. The other way you could use a journal, and this can be with any age child, is you can use it almost like a pen pal, where one of you writes, you leave it for the other on their bed, and then the other one responds. So maybe mom writes in the notebook, hey, I was thinking about you today. I know that Thanksgiving is coming and dad's favorite was always sweet potato casserole. Do you think we should make that this year? And then leaving it on their bed. And then the child responds to the question and maybe asks you a question. You know, oh, I don't want to make sweet potato casserole because that was never my favorite. Could we do dad's other favorite of cranberry sauce? You know, again, it can go back and forth, but there's no pressure to have the conversation on the spot. They can take as long as they want to respond and give it back. And they know they're going to get a response from you. It's not going to be forgotten, or the other kids in the room and you forgot to answer that or didn't get back to the conversation. So sometimes that can be a helpful tool. Sometimes for our younger kids, using puppets, and I would say this is true for probably your 9-10-year-olds and under, is that it gives our kids a chance to talk about their feelings and be just a little bit removed. Because lots of times as that puppet is doing the talking, it's often what our child is thinking, but they feel enough of a disconnect that they are safe to say those things through the puppet that they may not be able to say directly to you. So puppets can be a great thing. A walk and talk, so that you're just walking and talking about whatever topics come up. Maybe, again, I mentioned the car early on about locations. That's a great place where you're talking in a place where minimal eye contact can occur, because as the driver, your eyes should be on the road, and your child doesn't have to feel like you're watching and waiting for them to respond. And sometimes a dark room, so you could have your child go ahead and go to bed. Maybe you lay in the bed with them, or you just sit in a chair in their room with the lights off while you talk and process what's happened for the day. So on day 5, we talked about ways to start the conversation. And there are 4 different types of conversations. You can do open and closed statements. So the difference with that is an open-ended question is going to allow for your child to expand on their answer. So they're going to give you more than a yes, no. A closed question would be, do you want vegetables for supper? The answer is yes or no. Where instead you may say something like, I was thinking about making vegetables for supper. Which vegetables are your favorite? So now I've left it open for them to add more to than just a yes or no. And the difference is you'll get more engagement, more conversations, and more sharing if we use the open-ended questions. The concrete and abstract thinking, for those of you who have kids who are 10 and under, they are in what's called concrete thinking. And what that means is they are very fact-based, very tangible. So this phone is real because I can touch this phone. That's what it means for concrete. Abstract usually starts around age 11 or 12. And again, this is a brain development thing. This isn't my kid is gifted or not gifted. This is just the way that the brain is made. And so by age 11 or 12, that abstract thinking starts to come in. And the difference there is they're able to connect with things that they can't touch. They know those things exist, even though they can't touch them. So, for instance, iCloud storage. We can't touch the storage, but we know it's there. Where when you're 10 and under, that's a really difficult concept to understand. And when we're talking about death, the idea of spirits, or if you enter in the religious part with heaven and things like that, those conversations get more complicated when our child is in that concrete thinking because they don't understand how they're here, but they're not here. So 10 words or less, and this is one I would encourage you to consider. It's something I use, and it's more about not getting up on our soapbox, not going into these long, over-explaining, long-winded conversations where less is more. So if we can say it in 10 words or less, say it in 10 words or less. Don't make it into a 2-hour conversation. So our grief conversations may only be 2 to 3 minutes, but they will build up over time. And so saying less in the beginning is okay because your kids don't always know what to talk about, might have a short attention span due to their age. And so it's okay to have smaller conversations. And if you can say it in fewer words, say it in fewer words. Be specific, not general. So you're avoiding general statements. So we're not going to walk in and say, how's your grief? We're going to be more specific and pick a topic that's more directed, and we can always come back and have more conversations. It doesn't mean you have to pick the one and only conversation, and if they contribute, great, or now you've lost your window of talk. It's just taking one topic at a time, which thing is most important, and then setting the rest aside until the next conversation. And we want to respond to what we see and what we hear. So they may be upset, and you can see that visually, but they're telling you they're not. It's okay for you to respond. You're telling me that you're not, that you're okay, but your eyes are filled with tears. it's okay to point those things out. And again, because you're being specific, you're inviting conversation. 4 ways to set goals and expectations. And this day 6 is really important, and it's setting some of those foundational moments that in all conversations, in all relationships, can get us in trouble. But when we're talking about grief conversations, these will really get in the way if we haven't taken a look at them. So number 1, we want to have no expectations, because in grief conversations, if we have an expectation of what's going to be talked about, who's going to say what, we're only leading ourselves to failure. And we want to listen and share with the expectation that we are just building on the relationship. We are not trying to solve or take away their grief. We are not trying to end all of their suffering. So again, trying to set all of those expectations aside. And we want to be curious. This is something with the entire Grief Talk Challenge that I hope that you will walk away with, is that we're just getting curious about our child's grief. We're not assuming that their grief is our grief, or that their grief looks like our grief. We're just getting curious about what they have to share, what they think about it, and how they feel. So we want to see life and grief through their eyes, not our lens. And our child is the expert on their feelings. Even though we may think we know better because of our experience, we want to let them lead. We want to let them figure it out, with us being there and being helpful and being part of that process. We also want to be careful that we are not making assumptions. So we don't want to make an ass out of you and me, which is a saying that's been around for a long time. And so we don't want to assume that we know what they're thinking, or we know what they have heard. For instance, sometimes our kids we assume they're playing their video game, but they're really half listening to us. And so maybe they have overheard a conversation, or they were hiding around the corner and we didn't know it, and they heard more than they should. And so getting curious about that, but also not having any assumptions, not assuming that they don't know anything. The other part of that is the internet is huge, and lots of things are posted in places that we don't always have control over. For instance, when Kobe Bryant died and that information was posted before his family was even notified, that's something that will forever be part of their grief story, is how they found that information out. And I know that many of you have found things out over the internet, over Facebook, that shouldn't have been on there, and there should have been a conversation. So protecting our kids and making sure that we know what they have seen or what they have heard, so that we can dialogue about that. And then having no judgment. So we want to put our judgment aside, because if we come to our kids with judgment, they're not going to share as much. And they're definitely not going to share their negative feelings, and it reduces trust. And it sets us up for failure for future conversations, because if they feel like they're going to be judged for how they feel about this loved one, or about the loss, or about grief in general, they're not going to come to us. And we really want them to come to us so we can help them, so that we can be part of that grief journey, and that they're not silently suffering. So I want to just kind of go through all of the blueprint all here together. And what that looks like is we started with roadblocks. We then talked about how to set the stage. Where do you have that conversation? preparing yourself, so getting yourself in a calm state. Then how do you have that talk? How do you have those conversations? And then how do you start the conversation? So what types of words do you use? The goals and expectations, and then putting that all together to make one blueprint. And that blueprint helps you have the start of not only the grief conversations, but important conversations in your household. So I also wanted tonight to invite you, in case you didn't get to attend the Grief Talk Challenge and you're here for the first time, I wanted to invite you to my Grief to Healing Kickstarter. And this course has 20 spots, and at this point, there are 18 spots left. And I would love for you to join this community and this Kickstarter group. And in this group, I wanted to spend some time sharing with you what you will be learning. So there are 3 aspects to the Kickstarter. We talk about grounding ourselves, so really understanding the foundation of what grief is, how our kids grow in grief, looking at routines and resilience, and then looking at the support. So who's in our village? What does it look like? Looking at expectations of our grieving child for us as parents, but also other people in our village. And then how do you individualize that, looking at friends and family and those supports, and then getting reconnected. So connected into having a future and a meaning and understanding of this loss. And so just a little bit more in depth of the Kickstarter is we will go through the signature grief system. And in this grief system, we're going to talk about the growing grief. So we're going to be looking at age-appropriate understanding of death, how to address grief, the effects of grief. We're going to be talking about routines and resilience and how our kids can be disrupted by grief, but also how to help them work towards healing and how it can change our routines and what we do or how we parent. We're also going to be talking about how to individualize grief, because grief is unique as a fingerprint. It all looks different for everybody. And even though we both may have lost a dad, it doesn't mean your experience is the same as mine. And so understanding that even if you have 3 kids, each of your kids may have experienced grief differently. It may look very different in how it's showing up in their life and how they're affected by their friendships or their school experiences based on their age. We're also going to be talking about expectations. So how does grief, your support village, your ways that you express grief, how does that look? And how do you want it to look? And then creating that new normal, strengthening your family, establishing ways to find meaning and celebrate and honor your loved one. So I just wanted to give you a little bit more in depth on each of the weeks. So the Kickstarter is a 5-week course. So on week 1, which would be coming up here on Sunday, November 6th, we're going to be talking about how grief shows up in children, how it might look, how each child understands death based on their age and their development, helping you explain the why. Because for a lot of kids, that why is such a common question. And as parents, sometimes we get stuck there because we're not sure what's age appropriate and what details to share or not share. And then also talking about the grief story and how do you talk with your child about the grief story and how do they integrate that grief story into their life. So we also, the second week, we'll talk about routines and resilience. So looking at the home routine, school routine, discipline, parenting supports, and then talking about how do you get the help that you actually want. Because when your loved one first dies, everybody shows up and asks you, how can I help? Because they all want to do something for you. But if you don't know how to answer that question, then sometimes we're stuck and it feels like we're alone and isolated. And so this is a really important piece. Again, looking at how do we individualize grief because everybody experiences it differently. So talking about how do you communicate with the school? How do you prepare your child to tell their friends or handle friends who maybe say things that are not supportive while they're at school? Mapping and knowing your polyvagal system. So again, your nervous system, understanding why you're responding the way that you are and your kids. And then I have some customizable templates that allow you to communicate easier with the school and with other important people. We're also going to be talking about expectations. So how do you talk about grief with your kids at home or in public? How do you address those conversations when they come up when you weren't expecting it or not ready? And then this is always a big one, is preparing yourself with the dumb shit that people will say. Because I guarantee you, some kid, some adult is going to say something that will catch you off guard that you didn't think anybody would ever say in real life. But it happens all the time. And then understanding the waves of grief, how grief kind of comes and goes, and then a timeline. So kind of understanding what this might look like over the long term. And then future and meaning, talking about ways to celebrate the life of our loved one, memories, rituals, and then picking out an item that might symbolize your loved one, especially for our younger kids. Sometimes this is helpful. So what's the support like in this course? In this course, it is a weekly group coaching call. So we'll have a mastermind call where we discuss the content for about 30-45 minutes. And then the rest of the time, we will be talking in a group through Zoom, where we can share our experiences, we can talk about how we've handled things, and then how does this information fit into your kids? How do you personalize it? And then practicing some of those things or conversations that you would like to have in your household. We will have a supportive Facebook group that is only for parents who are in the course. So it will be a much smaller group than in our Growing Up with Grief Facebook group. You will have direct contact to ask questions or comments, or if something comes up during the week where maybe you want some feedback on, here was the conversation that came up at the dinner table, here's how I handled it, I'm just looking for some guidance, then you can have the support of the Kickstarter group to cheer you on or give you some suggestions or some recommendations of how to handle those conversations. And then if you pay in full for the Kickstarter, one of the perks you get, because this is a founding members course, you will get 2 individual coaching sessions with me, which are one-on-one for an hour each, where we can talk about the information we've learned in the Kickstarter and then how to directly apply it to your kids and your situation. So one of the things I did want to highlight, and I think this kind of, I think it is a point where it can be confusing of counseling versus coaching. And so I just wanted to take a minute to explain what this looks like. So when it comes to counseling is to specifically address and resolve a mental health issue that is diagnosed. And generally you use insurance to pay for these services. It also is an issue that is affecting daily functioning, and it's been going on long-term for a long time. It's also usually chronic and unhealthy patterns, again, that have been going on for a long time that have been unresolved, possibly deal with childhood or trauma or some extra circumstances there. And when it comes to counseling, counselors are only able to work with people in the state that they are licensed. And right now, especially because of COVID, counselors in the field or in the area that I work in, as well as other counselors that I know throughout the US, all have waiting lists. It is difficult to find a counselor right now. So what's the difference in coaching? When it comes to coaching, I am taking all of my counseling expertise, but I'm applying it into the signature grief framework that I explained just a minute ago to help reduce those symptoms, those things that are showing up at your house because of grief. And we're going to be very specific with setting goals and outcomes, and we're going to have a specific time frame for how long we work together. So if you're joining the Kickstarter group, it's 5 weeks where we work together every week. You do have the option to add on one-on-one counseling or coaching sessions later on. So that's an option if the Kickstarter doesn't sound like it's for you. So also in coaching, it's very solution focused. We're not going back into your childhood issues. We're not trying to figure out why you think the way that you do, or why isn't this working, or why has my life looked like this. We are specifically looking at grief and how to help your children. And then the biggest difference, and part of the reason that I am so excited to move into the coaching arena, is that ongoing direct support between sessions. So when you're in counseling, it is generally you meet with your counselor once a week for 45 minutes to an hour, and then that's it until you see them the following week. With coaching, because of the Facebook group, because of the ability for us to connect, again, whether it's over Messenger, whether it's over Facebook, we're able to connect throughout the week. So you don't have to wait until the following week to get your questions answered. So again, just another way to look at this of counseling versus coaching. Counseling, my cost in my office is $150 an hour. If you were to take some type of mastermind course from me, per insurance, 60 minutes a week would be it. That's all the longer you would be able to be in that course. And then you wouldn't be able to have any Facebook contact with me because that's considered unethical according to the counseling arena. Group support would only come in if you were taking a group counseling, and the duration for most counseling for people to benefit and feel like they have made progress, generally, and this is speaking from experience with the clients that I've worked with, sometimes 6 months, but most of the time, because you're dealing with the deeper issues, it's a year or two of weekly or bi-weekly counseling. When we're talking about the Grief to Healing Kickstarter, the course is $497, and that's $497 for all 5 weeks. So already we're cheaper than counseling. And again, like I mentioned, this is a founder's course. So this is the one and only time that this course will be offered at this price point with this level of support. So during that 5 weeks, you are going to get the 5 mastermind classes, where I'm teaching for 30 minutes to 45 minutes. And then the rest of the time for that 90 minutes is us talking about the material and talking about how to apply it to your kids, to your specific situation. The Facebook support is, at this point, only the people who are part of the Kickstarter will be in this other group. This is separate from the Growing Up with Grief Facebook group. And that is included in the $497 price. And that group support is the other parents who are in the Kickstarter. So you can communicate with them during class, but also in the Facebook group. So you have ways to strengthen and expand your village with parents who are dealing with the same thing or a similar loss, and their children who are grieving as well. And for the Kickstarter, it is 5 weeks. So we are dedicating 5 weeks to helping your child on their grief to healing journey. So if you are interested in that, I would love for you to join and become a founding member. Like I mentioned, it is $497. This is the first and only time that it will be offered at this price point with this level of support. And so the value of this support is $19.97, and that's a 5-week course with the mastermind classes. You will receive the grief modules and the templates, those group coaching calls, and then the exclusive Facebook group. So what you would do if you are interested, you will fill out the Kickstarter application. We will then talk on a call to decide if you are a good fit for the group and if this is the right thing for you. And if it is, then you will be allowed to pay the $497. You can make it in 2 payments, but if you pay it all at once, then you get the 2 extra one-on-one coaching calls, and those are not an option if you do the payment option. So it's a bonus. Those are 2 one-hour calls with me that you can use during, and I have extended it for 6 weeks instead of 5 weeks so that you have that extra week at the end of the Kickstarter to use those calls. Those don't have to be used at any particular time during the 6 weeks, but you can set them up for when maybe there's a topic that you want some extra support with, or we're halfway through the Kickstarter and you want to go ahead and use it and make sure that you're on track and getting the most from the Kickstarter. These are just a bonus so that you can get the most from this course. And so just a reminder, if you have questions, please post them in the Growing Up with Grief Facebook group. I'd be happy to get on a call or answer your questions. And apply to be a founding member. If you're unsure if this is the right thing for you, or you're unsure if $497 is something that you can afford right now, I would be happy to get on a call and talk with you and see if this is a good fit for you and what we can do. And the doors close on this offer on Friday. And the Kickstarter will begin on Sunday, November 6th. We will be meeting on Sundays for our Kickstarter.